Ready when you are.
All right, good evening, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to Invest Atlanta Small Business Webinar. This week, we'll be covering the Brownfields Revolving Loan Fund Program. Now, I want to give you some information about Invest Atlanta. If you've never heard of us before, Invest Atlanta is the economic development arm of the city of Atlanta, coming out of the mayor's office. What we do is we focus on developing programs and opportunities for the citizens of the city of Atlanta to excel in both housing, workforce development, and of course, our small businesses. With us this evening, we have Ms. Cynthia Freeman from our economic development team, and she's going to help us and lead us in this conversation about Brownfields, as well as the opportunities we have with getting funding for our developments here in the city of Atlanta. Oh, I do have some housekeeping though, so don't you forget. Guys, we want to make sure that we hold our questions off until the end. There is a chat Q&A function, so if you have some questions that are burning on your heart, you don't want to forget them, type them into the chat, but we will be addressing the questions and giving answers to those questions towards the end of the presentation. So just be patient with us. We see your questions, but we won't be answering questions till the end. Just put them in the chat, all right?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome again. I'm Cynthia Freeman. I'm with Invest Atlanta. I manage the Brownfields Revolving Loan Fund, and that's the funding mechanism for Brownfield projects. I'm happy you all decided to join us today. And with us, we have Jessica Lavendier. She's with the City of Atlanta. She's our Brownfield expert. So what you're going to learn this evening, you'll learn everything you need to know about Brownfield. You'll learn how to get started and how to finish and get to the end of your project. So without further ado, I'll take this opportunity to introduce you to Jessica. Thank you, Jessica.
All right, thank you. I wanted to thank Invest Atlanta for putting this webinar together and helping us get the word out about our Brownfield program, and also for all of you for attending the webinar today, because it is a team effort, Brownfield redevelopment. So we'll have a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully we'll answer all of your questions about Brownfields, and then we will be answering questions later on. So we'll get started, and we'll post this presentation on our website so you can refer back to it in the future. So let me see. Sorry, let me see how we can move our presentation for some reason.
You should be able to just click enter.
I know. I'm trying to see why we're not moving forward. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. All right, so we'll start with the definition of a brownfield, and this is EPA's definition. And a brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse, which may be complicated by the presence or the potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And in the city of Atlanta, that takes many forms. We have an abundance of brownfields throughout the city. As many of you know, the city has an extensive rail network developed over 150, 100, 200 years of development, and a lot of industrial use is located next to that rail network to be able to move goods around. And some of those industrial uses are no longer there, so we have the legacy of pollution at those sites. Also, we have a lot of older neighborhoods in the city, and they have the older gas stations and dry cleaners are located in these neighborhoods. And as many of you know, the city is very hilly, and people prefer to develop on a flat site. So there was a practice of getting dirt that in many cases was contaminated to level a site and do a development. So we have sites that maybe you wouldn't think would be brownfield sites, but they have a lot of contaminated soil. In many cases, it's contaminated with lead. So that's really pervasive throughout the city of Atlanta. So in recognizing that brownfields are a barrier to redevelopment and also create eyesores in communities in our neighborhoods, the city of Atlanta has participated in EPA brownfield grants for over 20 years. Our first grant was in, I think, the late 1990s when EPA started this brownfield program. So our program is funded with EPA grants. We currently have two types of grant. The assessment grant, which is a very competitive grant, and it's the one that we have is a 3-year grant, and it ends in September 2023. With that grant, we do phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, and we can also do a hazardous building materials survey, and we can do site-specific cleanup plans. The other grant we have is the Revolving Loan Fund. And with that program, we provide loans to private property owners and grants to nonprofits to clean up brownfield sites. Now, the grants, depending on which one we're using, it could be up to 200,000 or up to 500,000 for the award. So we have currently have two revolving loan fund grants. These grants are we can supplement the funding if we meet certain criteria that EPA has. If we've depleted our funds, we can request additional funding to capitalize our loan program. And that grant can go up to 15 years. So the original 2009 grant is coming to its 15th year, so it'll be ending in 2024. And in October, we received a new grant, and that's funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So that's right now a 5-year grant. And as we deplete that funding and we request more, we can continue that grant for 15 years. So one of the requirements is that we have a pipeline of projects that we show there's demand for our revolving loan fund. And so even if we don't have funding for a project now, or if you have a project that will you think will come online in a year or two, we can put that in our pipeline of projects to demonstrate to EPA that we have an active program. So there are many requirements in this program. One of them is that we cannot use the funding for sites on their national priorities list, the NPL list. But it's most commonly known as the Superfund site. So last year, the year before, the West Side Lead was designated as a Superfund site, and that covers the English Avenue and Vine City neighborhoods. So those neighborhoods have a high concentration of lead. This area was a hilly area, and Mr. English wanted to build a neighborhood for the people that worked at the industrial sites located to the north of Hollowell, like Excelsior Mill, or the Puritan Mill, for example. And so he imported a lot of contaminated waste, maybe from those same mills, and leveled the site so he can build the houses. And now they're very contaminated. So if you have a project in English Avenue or Vine City, you need to contact EPA. Mr. Tolliver is a coordinator. They'll come and test the site, and as funding is available, they'll remediate the sites. So we unfortunately cannot work in that area. So a little bit about the goal of the program. We want to, of course, improve the quality of life of the residents of the city of Atlanta. We want to revitalize our neighborhoods and increase our tax bases. So we want to encourage the sustainable redevelopment of brownfields. We want to protect the human health and the environment. We want to bring jobs into the city. We want to bring jobs into the neighborhoods. We want to, have a well-run and effective brownfield program. One way we do that is by reaching out and extending our program and expanding our partnerships. So, and this is an example of that, this webinar. We also, through this brownfield program, we want to support our comprehensive development plan. We do a lot of planning with our neighborhoods. We want to support their vision and goals. And working with Invest Atlanta, we want to support their plan. So in 2020, they developed this economic mobility, recovery, and resiliency plan, and it has certain strategic objectives. One of them, they want to create good jobs. So these good jobs are accessible jobs for current residents of the city of Atlanta that are in neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested. They want to also attract jobs. If you 25% of the population of the city has a college degree. So the majority of City of Atlanta residents do not have a college degree. So we need to attract good jobs, good paying jobs for them. And the ones that are the most promising are ones that are common in the industrial sector, like transportation, warehousing, construction. So a lot of our brownfields are in industrial area. So we want to see redevelopment of these industrial areas to support jobs that meet the needs of our residents. So one example of one of our target area, and I'll show a map later, is what we call the Atlanta area wide, which is the area around Murphy Crossing. So it's a historically a industrial area with a lot of neighborhoods that surround that. So we want to see jobs that those neighborhoods, the people that live there can access those jobs. Through this plan, Invest Atlanta seeks to support small businesses and also bring investment into neighborhoods. So it's similar to what we want to do. We want to remediate gas stations and dry cleaners that were historically located in many of these neighborhoods. And, we want to retain buildings that are 50 years or older that might have asbestos or lead paint through our program, and keep that distinctive character of the neighborhood through our Brownfield program. A big focus of the Invest Atlanta in the city is the construction of and retention of affordable housing, so that it will continue to support the development of multifamily affordable housing near employment centers and near transit. So in the same way, we seek to support the construction of affordable housing, not only near employment centers and transit, but also in our commercial corridors. So these two maps, one shows the extensive rail corridor network inside the city of Atlanta. And the blue are parcels that have industrial zoning that might not be up to date, but they're also beyond this. There are a lot of parcels that historically had industrial zoning. They might be in a different zoning category. So those are, recognized environmental conditions, potential brownfield sites. So we look at, where they're located in the city. And then on the other side, we have one of the things that EPA requires is what's the target area for our brownfield funding? Because we can't, provide services throughout the city, or what are the areas that most need brownfield investment because they're impacted by brownfield. So some of you might be familiar with Groundworks Atlanta. It's a nonprofit that focuses on brownfield redevelopment in MPUG and D an area. You can see that it has an extensive rail network and industrial land uses and brownfield. So they're focusing in that area, and we seek to support their work with our grant funding. Proctor Creek is also an area that has been impacted by brownfields, and then the area that we call the Atlanta area wide, which is around Murphy Triangle, Fort McPherson, and then Jonesboro Road further south, where it's an area that has also an extensive industrial uses along that rail network. We also have commercial corridors throughout the city, Memorial Drive, Hollowell, Boone Boulevard, the Stadium neighborhoods, Atlanta Beltline. All of those areas are priority areas for our Brownfield program. So there are a lot of requirements for the program. And so I wanted to go over that to make sure if anybody's interested that you know ahead of time what some of the requirements are. The first thing is that the applicant can't be liable for the contamination under CERCLA. And the applicant can't be affiliated with anybody that could be liable for the contamination. And the applicant can't have any penalties, be responsible for any penalties that because of a non-compliance, environmental non-compliance for a site. And the owner has to meet a requirement for liability protection. And the common ones are you're a prospective purchaser. So you're going through the process of purchasing a site that might be a brownfield, or you might be adjacent to a site and there's a migration of a contamination to your site from an adjacent site. It could be a dry cleaner or a gas station. That's pretty common that that pollutant migrated over to your site, or you're an innocent landowner. And you also have to have completed, as part of a purchase of a site, the all appropriate inquiries, where you do the research to through a phase 1 environmental or a phase 2 to determine, if there's a contamination on the site, or maybe you did an assessment to see if there was asbestos at the building. So we are looking for applicants to have completed that work. And then I know it doesn't apply for every site, but we prefer sites be enrolled through the Georgia EPD Brownfield program. So EPA prefers the sites to have oversight from a state response program. So usually, as part of the process, when a site is being purchased, you have 30 days to enroll that property in the EPD Brownfield program and submit a corrective action plan that details your strategy for remediation of the parcel. So EPA, we have a project officer and they're very hands-on. We work with them weekly, daily, and they, monitor all of the work that we do, and they approve every loan or grant that we provide. So we have to provide documentation to demonstrate that this is an eligible applicant and an eligible site, and they sign off on that. So once they sign off on the site, then we can move forward with the loan or a grant. So a grant, we can give a grant to a nonprofit that owns the Brownfield site. So additional requirements is that the applicant has to have a unique entity identifier. And if you don't have one, you can go to sam.gov and register and obtain your unique identifier. Now, the funding can only be used for brownfield related purposes, which, should go with, that should be evident. So our program is subject to audit by the federal government. So if they are auditing our program, they want to follow how all the funding was spent. So you have to keep the records really, or the applicants have to keep the records for a minimum of 3 years. And in the event that we're audited, you have to allow the whoever's doing the auditing to review the records related to the revolving loan fund. So this gives you a flow chart of our program, and so there are a lot of stakeholders involved. Of course, the EPA project officer. So I work with the City of Atlanta, Department of City Planning, and the Office of Zoning and Development. And we have what EPA calls a qualified environmental professional. It's our environmental team, environmental consultant. Then we have the applicant, could be a private property owner or a nonprofit, and they have their own environmental consultant. And then we have Invest Atlanta, the board, and the staff. And we each have a role and responsibility throughout the process of our revolving loan fund. So this is in general. We'll go into details, more details on some of these. But after we have a discussion about your project and we think it'll be a good fit with our program, you submit an application and your environmental documents and the cleanup plan. We submit the information to EPA. They determine that it's eligible. They sign the form. Then Invest Atlanta, Cynthia, will talk about their process, their loan review and approval, and then we'll have a closing. And our environmental consultant needs to prepare certain documents that are required. We have a community involvement plan. I know typically brownfield remediation is between property owner and EPD, and your environmental consultant, but with federal funds, there's a community engagement portion of this. Now there's some cross-cutting requirements, and we'll go over that. Then you'll do your site remediation. You'll go through a permitting process. We require Davis-Bacon wages. Our environmental consultant monitors the work to make sure that this being conducted in a manner that's protective of the human health and the environment and per the cleanup plan. And Cynthia will talk about the draw requests. Then we have a closeout report. And then after the cleanup is completed, then you start the loan repayment process through Invest Atlanta. So I think I'm going to have Cynthia talk about their process now.
Good evening again, everyone. So Invest Atlanta comes in not on the tail end, but in the middle of this process. Jessica takes care of the front end. We come in the middle. Jessica comes back in, and then we finish off with your loan repayment. So the first step is to make sure that the application you submit is complete and you have your financial information. And I take the application, I look through all of the financial documents. I make sure that this is a good, viable project for the city of Atlanta and for Invest Atlanta. We have a couple of committees that the process has to go through for approval. The first one is our internal loan committee. They take a look at the project, they review it, approve it for the loans and for the subgrants. They give us an approval. And if everything is in order, we take it to our next committee, which is our finance committee, so that they take a look to make sure that this is a good financial viable project for the city of Atlanta. Then it goes to our economic development committee to make sure that economically this is a good project as well for the city. Once all of that takes place, then it goes to the Invest Atlanta board, which is chaired by the mayor of the city. And once it's approved there, now we start with the actual getting everything ready so that you can start receiving the funds. The first thing is our commitment letter, and the commitment letter is an agreement between Invest Atlanta and the applicant. It has a list of due diligence items that the applicant agrees to do in order to get the funds or in order to get the loan or the grant. And once the commitment letter is signed by the applicant and signed by Invest Atlanta, then we move forward to the closing documents. It's closing this grant and closing the loan is a legal process. So lawyers are brought in, our closing attorney comes in, we close the grant, we actually close the loan, which means that the applicant signs off on the grant and the applicant signs off on the loan, as well as Invest Atlanta. And now this is a legal document that everybody agrees to. Next slide, Jessica. Then once everything is in place, now it's time for you to draw down the funds. So we have a drawdown request form, and with that form, you tell us how you're going to use this money. Say, for example, you get a $50,000 grant or a $50,000 loan. That draw request will tell us, I'm drawing down $25,000 and I'm going to spend the money on this portion of the project. Once that drawdown is submitted, we review it, we approve it, and then the qualified environmental professional looks at it, reviews it, and he or she approves it. And once all of the expenditures approved, now we can move into the drawdown process. And in that drawdown process, we are able to send the funds directly to you via ACH or via wire. And once you receive all the funds, you do the work, and then the process starts all over again. You can do the drawdown in one draw, two draws, three draws, but you will continue the drawdown process until all of the funds that were approved for your project have been drawn down. And then we start the loan repayment process. In the case of a grant, there is no repayment process, but in the case of a loan, There is a repayment process. We do give the applicant a deferment period so that they can, get all of their everything in order before they start the payment process. And usually the repayment process is based on what we decided in the commitment letter. And a lot of times, depending on the size of the project, the payback period could be anywhere from 5 years to 10 years, just depending on what you're trying to do with your project. And once the repayment process starts back, then you'll be dealing strictly with Invest Atlanta, basically me, and we will continue to receive your payments until all the payments have been paid back. And if you decide you're on another project, you start the project again. Thank you, Jessica.
All right. Thank you. Let's see. So I was going to talk about some of the other requirements. So as you know, we have our environmental professional, part of our team. So we have to do 2 documents. I know you do your phase 1 and phase 2. Our team, we do what EPA calls an analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives. So we look at, 3 options for the site. It could be a no action. It could be, removal or encapsulation or institutional controls on how to address the contamination on the site. And then we make a recommendation on what the best approach for the remediation is. And, we work with your team and make sure that we all agree on the next steps for the site. The other document is a quality control document. It's called the Quality Assurance Project Plan. We want to make sure that the site, the cleanup is, conducted in a way that's protective of human health and the environment. So there's some sampling requirements, and it talks about the process of how we're going to move forward with that. Now, I mentioned the community involvement plan. So we're required to have a community meeting and have a 30-day public comment period. So, and we typically have a web page for each loan, and the web page will have the APCA community involvement plan, fact sheet, and notice about the community meeting. And I typically also reach out to the neighborhood planning unit or the neighborhood and present information about the project. So our environmental professional, as Cynthia says, will go out to the site, we'll monitor the work, and we'll review the invoices to make sure that all of the everything on the invoice is an eligible expense. And then we'll work with your the applicant's environmental professional on the closeout report. So this is an example. If you want to come on Thursday, January 26th, we're working with a nonprofit called Remerge on Auburn Avenue. Where the loan was approved in November. We're in the process of closing out, doing the closing out the grant. And we have the meeting at their offices at 340 Auburn to talk about the project and the cleanup. And when you see the fact sheet right there, it's a house, or it's a former house, it's a church that has some asbestos and some soil contamination in the rear yard. And then you can see the web page there, and there's information about this project. So a little bit about the cross-cutting requirements. If any of you have worked with any federal funds, they all have require compliance with federal laws. The first one is the National Historic Preservation Act. So we have to, each state has a state historic preservation office, and they review all federal undertakings. So we have to submit documentation to them to state how the federal funds will be spent. And they have to determine whether there'll be an effect or no effect. If there's an effect, if it's adverse effect or no adverse effect. And then they'll say, there's no adverse effect, you can move forward. Or if there's an adverse effect, then we have to do a memorandum of agreement and mitigate the adverse effect. So the first submittal is a 30-day process, and then hopefully there's no adverse effect and we can move forward. If there's an adverse effect and we have to go through a memorandum of understanding, then it'll be a longer process to make sure that, you know, everybody, they sign off on that memorandum of agreement. Something that is not as common in the city of Atlanta is compliance with the Endangered Species Act through the Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of the land in the city is impacted urban area, so we don't have any endangered species. There might be some sites that might along a river that might have wetlands that might be subject to the Clean Water Act. We have to report our MBE, WBE, and we have a 4% requirement for our applicants, which usually a lot of labs or drillers, you know, can help meet that requirement. The main thing is that we have to meet Davis-Bacon. So you have to pay prevailing wages. So one of our QEP sub-consultant is monitors for Davis-Bacon. So we have to know when the work is going to happen at the site, and the sub-consultant will be there and interview, make sure that the workers are getting paid fair wages, and then we'll also review the payroll to make sure that you're paying prevailing wages, and we'll get the prevailing wages for that. There's some requirements for OSHA, worker health and safety. And with this new award is from the infrastructure law, and there are new requirements, and I'm not sure that they apply, but for some, if you're using steel or you have to buy American, but usually we're removing things. But in the case that there's something, maybe if it's a roofing project and you're using some kind of steel, we have to make sure that we're using American-made products. So I wanted to give you some examples of some of the work that we've funded through our revolving loan fund. This is a retail, a historic commercial building on RDA and Cascade, and they had 2 dry cleaners there. And in coordination with the Historic Preservation Division, it wasn't practical to excavate the contamination and undermine the building foundation. So the decision was made to install an SVE, a soil vapor extraction system that vents to the roof, and then do some sealing, so create a vacuum in the floor, some of the retail spaces. And Cynthia and I were there examining and learning about SVE system. So this was, and then the spaces were sold one by one. They were renovated and new tenants came in, and they're right across from one of the proposed Beltline parks. This was a big loan that we did to Atomic Entertainment for Pratt Pullman. As you're familiar with that, as a big industrial complex between the Edgewood and the Kirkwood neighborhood, just south of DeKalb Avenue. And they have very large industrial buildings. They worked with DeKalb County. They also have a revolving loan fund. And with DeKalb County, they remediated some of the soil on the southern end of the building. And we worked with them to remediate asbestos in some of the larger buildings on the site. And if you've been there, if you've been by there, you know how big those buildings are. And they had a lot of asbestos in their roofing system. So that's a big ongoing project for us. We worked with Trees Atlanta. They have grown, and they provide a wonderful service everywhere in the city. And they want to consolidate all of their 3 offices to one location on Warner Street, just south of the farmers market in the Murphy Crossing area. And they had some, so it's a site that had been industrially used for many years, but I think that they had some lead contamination, maybe from, as I mentioned, it's common that people would bring contaminated soil, contaminated waste to level out a site. So in this picture, you see some of that was being excavated out for their headquarters that should be opening this spring. This is another site where a company in Marietta brought their drums with contaminated material and buried it or dropped it at this location in the Riverside neighborhood, just across from the Chattahoochee River, and they dumped that material there. And the neighborhood had been working with the Conservation Fund for many years to create a new 10-acre park in proximity of the Chattahoochee River. So we provided them a grant to pay for that soil removal. This is 800 tons of soil was removed. So I think that this is my last slide. So we have our website is atlantagA.gov/brownfields, and it has information about our assessment grant on the top, and then below that there's information about the revolving loan fund. So there's a fact sheet, there's the manual, a guide that gives you a lot of information. There's application and the flow chart that I showed earlier. So as I mentioned, we have a new grant that's funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law. So there are new requirements. So we have to update our manual and the loan to reflect EPA's requirement that are made through this new bipartisan infrastructure law. So my name is there with the email and my number, and you can contact me anytime, and we can discuss any projects that you have in mind, or any questions that you have. We can, have a conference call with our environmental professional and try to answer any questions you have. But right now, I think I'm going to, I think that's it. I'll stop sharing. And I think now we have some time to answer any comments or questions from people that are participating in our webinar. And you're muted, Kelsey.
There we go. I couldn't get off mute. It was stuck. They didn't want me to talk. Listen, Jessica, I appreciate you so much for this information. It's a lot. And it's been really, really difficult to accurately and effectively communicate about brownfields, especially because all the development is happening in the city right now. And a lot of the areas that are experiencing development are in fact brownfield areas. Like I'm very familiar with the Auburn Avenue project that's going on right now as well. We do have a couple questions in the chat, so we'll get to that. But I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Kelsey Maynor. I am the small business advocate for Invest Atlanta. So we'll be having a lot more programs like this, a lot more webinars every week to kind of break down some of the conversations that are being had about small business in the city. And so the question that we have in the chat is, the first one is, do we have to do an assessment before we apply and get the grant to pay for the phase 1 and 2 reports?
So the revolving loan fund is to pay for cleanups, not for assessment. So we get that a lot. So people have paid, and sometimes a substantial amount of money as part of a purchase of the property. They've done a phase 1, and the phase 1 identifies a recognized environmental condition, and the environmental consultant recommends a phase 2. And then the phase 2 involves mobilizing a rig to the site and taking samples, sending it to a lab. And if there's concentrations of contaminants above a certain level, then there's a requirement to clean up the site. So that's where the revolving loan funds come in. So we can pay for remediation, but we don't pay for assessment. So, but at this point, as I mentioned, we have 2 grants. We have the assessment grant. So that assessment grant that will end in September, we have the ability to pay for some assessments between now and the summer. So, and there's similar requirements. We want to target our limited funding to our areas that I mentioned along the rail corridor, neighborhoods that have really impacted by brownfields, and where the market isn't as strong to pay for that brownfield redevelopment.
Okay, okay. So to answer the question clearly, the revolving loan fund does not cover assessments, but currently we do have a grant that can cover some assessments, and that grant ends in September.
That's right. So,
All
so then, and then in September, so EPA, just so you know, grant period, they take grant applications September to November. And they fund about 25% of the grants that they receive. So it's very competitive. And if we intend to apply for a assessment grant, and if we're selected, then we'll have funding in a year, a year later. And then we have to go through a procurement process. So like in 2 years, we'll have funding for assessments again.
So once this ends in September, we probably won't, or possibly won't have funding again for another 2 years.
That's right.
Okay, good to know. Good to know.
Yeah.
There was another question. I'm going to ask it. Maybe it makes sense to you. It says, I think it goes along with one of the slides you had maybe 10 minutes ago. So the question is, it appears the seller cannot stay in any development deal as carried equity if the currently own a brownfield site, if you're going to apply for these funds. Is that correct? Is that confusing?
Yes, it's confusing. What do you?
I know it is, but it's funny because when when the question popped up, I understood it because it was going along with the slide. I feel like you said something about if you were owning the property and selling it, what is the process of owning the property, owning the land, and as far as participating in the brownfield programs that we have?
Yeah, so when you own a site, you had to, as part of the purchase, part of your due diligence, you had to do the all appropriate inquiry to make sure that you were aware as part of the purchase, the situation with that piece of property, if there were contaminants on the site.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to usually enter it into the brownfield program and remove that liability. Now, like if you own that property, EPD also has a voluntary cleanup program for people that own a brownfield site and then do that due diligence. And every case is different. So I prefer to talk to the person, talk to EPA, talk with our environmental professional, and see if there's a way that we can work with them on a potential loan. So I don't want to say no to anybody, because there are a lot of circumstances.
Right. Got a couple questions popped in. All right, the next question is, can the seller stay in the deal as a partner of the new buyer developer? They're trying to clarify that original question.
Yeah, no. If there's any liability, you can't be liable. You have to be like a prospective purchaser, innocent landowner, or a contiguous property owner.
When
I'm not sure.
What do you mean by liability? So what if I bought a property, and now I've never tested land, I've been sitting on this property, and now I'm ready to sell the property, but it comes up and it could be part of this brownfield experience of contaminated land. But what is the liability that we're discussing?
Yeah, so you own the property, so you're liable for it. And going through the Brownfield program, you remove that liability because you're committed to remediating the parcel. You're coming in, you do your due diligence, you identify the contamination, you have a plan for remediation. So if the previous owner is going to be part of the new ownership structure, we'll have to look into that, because usually all of the work that we've done has been with new owners coming into purchasing a brownfield site.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Joel said that was his question. He was very trying to figure out that liability piece. Now I felt that, I knew that was a question that it came up earlier during your slides. Miss Cynthia, if you have a moment, I have questions because I went to a Brownfield conference and I had a lot of questions because I don't know anything about this space. And I know I get a lot of questions about development. So what are some questions that come up that you've ran across that I think a lot of people who are in the watching this webinar may have some similar questions that we can answer for them? What are some of those typical questions that you get?
One thing, I don't know if Cynthia, but one thing is that, there's more community engagement, and people are not used to that community engagement. And we go to the neighborhood and we're very upfront about, this is a brownfield. This is exactly how that funding is going to be used for that brownfield assessment. And we have to take community input into consideration in our program. And, if there wasn't this funding, people wouldn't have to do that part. And the other part is that Historic Preservation Division, we have to show exactly what work is going to be done with that funding. So we have to go, and if there's asbestos and, asbestos tile on the floor, we show where the tiles are, and we have to say, these tiles are going to be removed, and then this is what's going to go in its place. So we have to be very clear as to how that funding is going to be used. And you have to be open to them commenting and having recommendations if they don't agree with the proposed renovation of the building.
Okay. Oh, question. Not, this is my personal question, sorry. So as far as like a timeline, say I have this property I just purchased and I'm trying to do some development on it. Like what's the I know it may be based case by case. What's like a timeline for approaching you all about the brownfield, and then going through the community piece and the testing piece and showing like what is the timeline for between starting this process and actually getting it started?
Jessica, 60 days, maybe?
You have to bring your patience. So things take longer than you think. So the first thing is you have to submit the application and work with Cynthia and provide all the financial documentation. And Invest Atlanta board meets once a month. And there's some committees that this has to go through certain committees for their review. So you have to allow for that time. And then you have to allow time for the closing of the loan. And while that's happening, I can work with the loan recipient on the community engagement and start working on the historic preservation review. So
you can work simultaneously. Is this kind of like going through the process? You can start working on your side.
That's right.
Okay.
So one example, Remerge was approved in November by the Invest Atlanta board, November 15th or so. We're having our community meeting on the 26th. They're working on their plans and they hope to start the permitting process in April. So we try to work with whatever that permitting process is.
Got it.
So Kelsey, you asked about questions that we normally get. One that we always get all the time is who gets a grant and who gets the loan.
Ooh. Yeah.
So you have to be a nonprofit to get a grant, and for-profit companies get loans.
Okay. Is there any point in time where this loan turns into a grant, or we're gonna have to pay all that money back? Just I gotta ask.
You're gonna have to pay all of the money back.
Okay.
So one thing you can think about is you're paying, give you a loan, you pay it back, and that money that's being paid back, we grant it to a nonprofit. So we gave Atlanta Beltline, the initial loans were to the Atlanta Beltline for the East Side Trail and the West Side Trail, and they've been repaying that loan. So we have program income. So we use that program income to work with the nonprofits. So you're paying it forward.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
And I will say this, Kelsey, the terms are very generous. Normally, we do 10 years at 2%. We can't beat that.
Yeah, that's really good, especially with the rates we got going on right now. Wonderful. Any other I guess common questions that you all, it's common to you, but for us it's racking our brains trying to figure out.
I always get the question, do we have to do a phase one? I get that a lot.
And the answer,
So Jessica, yes.
Yes. So you have to either with an example with the Pratt Pullman, we had a previous assessment grant, and we worked extensively with them to get their project ready for the loan by doing the asbestos scope of work and working with them to competitively bid the project. So if we do have an assessment grant, we can work with them, but yes, you do need the phase one and phase two, because we have to have a clear understanding of what the contamination, what the issue is on the site, and how much it's going to cost to remediate a site. Now, one thing is we understand that sometimes, especially now, the costs can vary, can change a lot. And we've had that in a couple projects where they're going through a remediation process and the costs are more. Or one thing that happens is they identify additional contamination that wasn't identified at the beginning. So we don't want to leave a site contaminated. We want to finish the remediation. So in that case, we have to go back to the Invest Atlanta board to increase the loan or the grant amount so that the entire remediation can be completed.
so it goes back to the whole thing of being patient. We got
Right quick, Kelsey, I learned something this week too from Jessica. The phase one has a time limit on it. It does expire.
What is that?
The phase one has a time limit on it. It's only good for a year. So you can't do your phase one and then come to us 5 years later.
So you're saying, all right, so I have this property, I've been sitting on it for a while. I originally knew it had some contamination, but now that is, worth some money, I want to start developing, and now my phase one that I'm presenting to you has been dated. Yeah. Now I'm liable. Is that why?
Yeah, no, we need a up to date phase one, a recent phase one.
Okay. Okay. One last question. The last question is, he says $500,000 sounds like a small loan for development, especially when you mentioned the belt line. Is that the max loan amount?
No, so that's the grant amount.
That's
so we have so EPA wants us to have a sustainable program. So they recognize that we want to work with nonprofits and assist them with their brownfield redevelopment. It's a big lift for them, but we have to also half of the amount of our grant has to be loaned out, and no more than half can be granted out. So our loans there's no limit to the size of the loan. The limit is the amount of funding that we have at the time. But for nonprofits with the 2009 grant, the limit is $200,000. With the bipartisan infrastructure law grant that we just received, the limit is $500,000 for a grant.
Okay. Okay.
So for an example, for the East Side Trail, the loan was about $800,000, and it was higher for Pratt Pullman. So.
All right. No, one more question. Okay, thank you. I'm about to say no more questions. Okay. All right. So listen, I appreciate you guys so much. Jessica, thank you so much for taking your time out this Thursday evening to discuss Brownfields with us. Ms. Cynthia, thank you as always. You're amazing here at Invest Atlanta. We appreciate you and bringing the city of Atlanta with you for this informative conversation. I do want to remind everybody that's watching that we will be having webinars every month. That's a commitment. every month we're having small business webinars throughout the weeks to inform you further on programs that we have with Invest Atlanta and programs that we have going on with other organizations in the city. So stay tuned. Make sure you go to our website, investatlanta.com, go to events to see some of our webinars coming up. We have 2 webinars scheduled for next month in February. One talking about the opportunity zones. Opportunity zones are tax allocation areas in the city that we can discuss, as well as we'll have IPCOM coming on here to talk about some smarter ways to do marketing for your small business. We also have a in-person, no more web, in-person mixer at Pittsburgh Yards, February 23rd. We'll be having an in-person mixer at Pittsburgh Yards. We'll have some of our business accelerator partners that help our businesses grow rapidly and get your things organized. So we're excited to have that program coming up at the end of this month, end of February. So stay tuned for that. Again, go to investatlanta.com and go to our events section to see the upcoming events as they're being updated. Ms. Cynthia, you got any closing words?
No, just thank you.
Wonderful, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, we'll be here next month with 2 more webinars for you. Please go onto our website and check it out. My name is Kelsey Maynard. I'm the small business advocate for Invest Atlanta. Yeah, Ms. Cynthia Freeman, she is the money lady. I'm kidding. No, she's actually over our loans programs. So with that being said, we appreciate your time. You have a great evening. Be safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.